Good morning, Dawg Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. Let me tell you everything we're going to be doing here over the course of the next few minutes. Here's the important thing to note, that this show today actually adds as a sort of lead-in to a big day for Dawg Nation later on this afternoon. We're going to be live on the air roughly 12:45 p.m. or so here on the East Coast for the announcement of Ekene Ogboko, four-star offensive lineman, the brother of Nnamdi Ogboko, the Georgia defensive lineman. Ogboko getting ready from his home state of North Carolina to make his college pledge. We will cover that for you live today. Our Jeff Centel and Kaylee Manziel on the scene up in the Tar Heel State for that. We'll have that for you here today. Now, in honor of that, we're going to try to create some space between our broadcast and that broadcast, which, of course, I will be anchoring. We're going to try to create some space between the two shows, which means we're going to try to keep it moving today. How well we do with that, I guess, will be left in the eye of the beholder. Not always something I'm successful with, but we're going to try our best. Now, before that, though, we're going to still have a great show for you. Pretty interesting war of words right now between the SEC and the Big Ten. We're going to tell you more about that on the show today. Our Cody Chaffins, who frankly is always doing so many great things for us, is also going to be the guest on today's show. Normally it's Mike Griffith on a Wednesday. Mike had some personal business to take care of, so Cody in place of Mike. Good day to have Cody on the show, though, because he's covered a lot of these recruiting announcements, the likes of which we're going to see from Ogboko today. So that's going to be kind of fun. It's actually one of my favorite things to do, and so I know Cody enjoys them as much as I do. So we'll do that here today. We're going to look at the historic nature of kind of what's about to take place for the Kirby Smart coaching tenure. That'll be fun. And off the top, one of our favorite guys had said something pretty interesting and fairly straightforward about what it's going to take for Georgia to have great success here in 2025. We like these keys to victory, these sort of simple plans for success. If you keep it simple, I have a much better chance of understanding it and following it all. And so I thought our guy Jake Fromm did a good job of that yesterday. If you missed it, we're going to play it for you right off the top here today. We're glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management. They handle bugs and critters.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Big day for UGA recruiting. We're all over that. In fact, we'll have more on that here coming up in just a couple of moments. Prior to that, though, I want to look at the dogs on the field here for the upcoming season. And obviously, we spend a lot of time kind of talking about this sort of thing on a daily basis. And I think the general consensus among, certainly me and I think most of you, to the extent that I've been able to hear your opinion on this, is that most of us sort of feel that there are some legitimate questions being asked of Georgia. And there is some of what we saw from UG a year ago that does, I think, demonstrate need for improvement, issues that need to be fixed. If that were to replicate itself for the upcoming year, then you're talking about a season in which you're not likely to kind of fully accomplish all of your end-of-season goals. I think most of us are pretty realistic about that. And in sort of concurrent to that, I think there's also kind of a genuine belief, the sense that I get is that people, Georgia fans that I hear from, I would certainly put myself in this category, we are still mostly, I think, optimistic about what Georgia can be. I mean, the one thing that you probably won't hear me do is come out, very, very specifically, very, very directly and say, Georgia's going to win the national championship in 2025. I probably won't go on the record to that degree, but I'm here to tell you right now, I certainly believe they could. I really do. And frankly, I don't think from where Georgia was a year ago, or maybe where it was in 2023, to get to what it would look like to be a national champion again in 2025, I don't feel like that's some sort of impossible journey. I really don't. I think a couple of small fixes in a couple of key areas, I think it has the potential of sort of changing everything for UGA. So while there will be no sort of bold proclamations, no guarantees of national championships, frankly, I have too much respect for you as the audience to say that if I can't truly, mean it with the, ability to back it up, I'm just not going to vomit out a bunch of, nonsense just for some attention. I'm just not going to do that. But I do believe it's a possibility, and I think that you probably should as well. And so if we're kind of in that world, hey, Georgia's got some issues, and if they don't fix them, things may not be great. On the other side of the coin, if Georgia does fix a couple of key things, boy, it could be a really special season here once again. If that's kind of the world in which we live in, then obviously the tone of a lot of our discussions in these last few months have sort of sounded like, okay, well, what's it going to take to get there? What's it going to be? What is that success formula for Georgia? And because I'm not a very complicated person, I guess, I always like it when things are simple. I always like easy to understand, straightforward messages. If we can kind of whittle it down to kind of one point that everybody can remember, just sort of one simple thing, then I feel like we've probably done a pretty good job. And yesterday, I thought we got a really nice example of that. The former Georgia quarterback, Jake Fromm, always joins us here on Tuesdays. And at the very end of the conversation, I had kind of laid out with Jake something we had spoken about on our show sometime in the last couple of days, which is, this thought that, media, I think, has sort of said, oh, man, Georgia's got way more questions than we're used to seeing them have. And our point of, well, actually feels like most of what we're saying about Georgia right now, familiar with preseason conversations of years past, including in 2022 when Georgia went on to win a national championship. It doesn't feel like this conversation is all that different than what we've said in previous off seasons, including off seasons in which Georgia has won national championships. It just doesn't feel all that different. And so I asked Jake, I said, Jake, how optimistic are you about what you think Georgia can be this year? And I thought that Jake gave a pretty thoughtful answer on that, both in terms of, just like most of you, at least the best that I can tell, and certainly me, optimistic on the one hand, need to see improvement in other areas on the other hand. I thought that Jake kind of spoke on behalf of all Georgia fans pretty well yesterday. Let me let you hear what he had to say.
I think they definitely have some questions that need to be addressed, and I think some guys in some key positions to step up. I want to see more physicality in the trenches. I want to see the defense kind of get back to that dominance, that wreaking havoc that we saw, in 21 and 22, and Gunner coming off and going to be a first year starting quarterback. So they definitely have a lot of questions and a lot of answers that a lot of questions that need to be answered. I am optimistic because it's kind of teeing up to kind of be one of those kind of common themes of, hey, we're going to put them down, we're going to doubt them. And that's where Kirby kind of operates best with his messaging to the team. The guys get behind it. They believe in it, that everybody's doubting us. Everybody's putting us down. Nobody believes in us. And then they come out and do something special. So don't underestimate belief and messaging that Kirby can get through to these young guys and what they can develop. But it's really going to start here in the summer with this summer, conditioning program. And then really when they dive into camp and start figuring out what their identity is going to be as a football team.
So Jake is obviously a former player, sees the game differently than we do, perhaps. But in that particular comment from Jake, doesn't that sound like really, really similar to what most of us have been saying for most of the offseason? I do believe, as Jake alluded to, Georgia and its fans kind of comfortable in the nobody believes in us type, mode, whether that's somewhat orchestrated or legitimate. That's a comfortable place for Georgia fans to be. But in terms of the sort of areas for improvement or maybe focuses of concern for Georgia this season, he mentions quarterback, mentions defense, and kind of the trench play overall. Now, when it comes to Gunner Stockton as a starting quarterback, we have talked that topic to death, so I'm going to push that aside here for a moment. Jake mentions the defense kind of getting back to where it needs to be. And we actually talked about that a good bit yesterday, which is, not only do I feel pretty good about the Georgia defensive line in particular for this year, but they're sort of commonly viewed nationally as a top 10 unit. If Georgia's a top 10 defensive line, then the chance of being kind of an upper tier defense, I would say, are pretty good too, especially when the fact that they're probably as deep as anybody ever could be at inside linebacker. And I think the secondary sort of shapes up to at least be capable with Dalen Everett returning, KJ Bolden emerging, and then kind of whatever else happens around that. And I think in the case of the Georgia defense, it's important to know. And let's kind of focus on the defensive line part of this because we did spend a good bit of time talking about that yesterday. that you can look at 2021 when you had 3 first-round picks on your starting group and a guy like Jalen Carter as a backup. You can say that's a great defensive line as measured by any defensive line that's ever played in college football. It was truly a historic group. Georgia 2021 defense, I would say truly a historic defense overall as measured by any defense that's ever existed in college football prior to it, and perhaps that ever will exist in college football. That's what it was. 2022 defense, probably not quite historic, but Georgia's been playing football for 100-something years. There aren't very many players at Georgia better than Jalen Carter. I mean, it's one of the best. He's one of the best players this program has ever produced. So you at least had sort of a historic figure in some respects, kind of on that defense there at that time. Here's what I'm going to tell you about Georgia in 2025. They don't have to be great as measured by every unit that's ever existed in the history of the sport. They don't have to be historic. They just need to be stellar as compared to the other defenses currently in college football, or stellar as compared to the opposing offensive lines they'll have to do battle with. That's true for the defensive front, for the defense overall. It doesn't have to be historic. It just has to be excellent. Excellent as compared to the other defenses in college football. In fact, I talked about this with Connor Riley yesterday. It's like there are 130-something teams playing Division I college football. If you're like 12th or 13th best among all of those, that's the 90th percentile nationally. We would say that certainly last couple of years, Georgia's probably as a defense sort of been outside that sort of 90th percentile, what I sort of think of as that sort of excellent range. Georgia's been out of the kind of elite category. If they can just sort of take steps to be back into that again, not historic greatest of all time, just among the best in this given year, that goes a long way towards competing for a championship, being back in that conversation, which also brings me to the other thing that Jake mentioned, which is sort of the trench play overall. And it's kind of worth noting, if you go back during spring practice, Kirby talked about, we want to stop the run. We want to, we want to be able to run the ball effectively. We want to be able to do those two things. That's the sort of trench play, line of scrimmage play that Jake Fromm's, also referencing. But when you look at Pro Football Focus, which we talked about yesterday, preseason magazines, which we talk about, a good bit, you're seeing most of the Georgia position groups, including the defensive line, sort of mentioned as a top 10 unit fairly consistently. There's really only one position group that doesn't get a lot of preseason top 10 national love for Georgia right now, and that's along the offensive line. Now, you do have the one sort of voice in the wilderness, Cole Kubelik. We played this audio for you going back weeks ago. Cole's out there saying he believes it's going to be the best offensive line in the SEC, and boy, I'd love for Cole Kubelik to be right about that, and if you're a Georgia fan, I'm sure you would too. But for the most part, he's been a little bit of an outlier in terms of the overall opinions here. For the most part, we have kind of seen Georgia not really be mentioned in the sort of elite stellar category from a preseason expectation standpoint when it comes to the offensive line. So to kind of bring this back to the theme, which is simple success formula, simple keys for success. Jake Fromm says, you got to be better on the lines of scrimmage. You got to be better in the trenches. Well, guess what? The major voice in the national media think the defensive line part of this has a very good chance of coming true. There is more skepticism, though, on the other side of the ball with the offensive line, which means I think we can almost whittle it down into this simple of a message. That the entirety of Georgia's success formula this year, so much of that rests on, can the offensive line show improvement? You had good individual performances a year ago. Dylan Fairchild, we loved him. Tate Ratledge, we loved him. Jared Wilson certainly respected, what he brought to the table. There was a lot to like about these guys a year ago. But for whatever reason, didn't quite gel. For whatever reason, didn't quite form a cohesive unit. And boy, there are probably 1,000 explanations as to maybe why that is. Injury is certainly one of the big ones. But for whatever reason, just wasn't quite the case. The unit playing together just didn't quite work out the way we thought it might. You got to be better with that here this year. So when Jake's on our show yesterday talking about keys to success, mentioning the defense, mentioning the quarterback, mentioning the line of scrimmage, we think based on the other chatter, it's almost like you circle in bold highlighter the offensive line perhaps more than anything else. And we know that's kind of in these summer workouts, soon to be fall camp, and certainly back in spring practice. We know that has been a big emphasis for Georgia, too. In fact, as a way of just kind of catching ourselves up, let's go back and remind ourselves about what Kirby Smart was saying about his offensive line going back to spring practice a couple of months ago now, but we're about to hear more of these kinds of messages as well when fall camp begins. This is Kirby from the spring.
Yeah, it's brand new. I mean, there's a lot of snaps that have left the building in terms of that. It's funny because I look at it as 4 starters left, 4 guys will be drafted, so your whole line's turning over. But then you look and say, Micah Morris started several games and played a lot. Drew Bobo started several games and played a lot. Ernest Green started several games, played a lot. Monroe Freeling started. So we're very fortunate that we had to play a lot of guys due to injury. So it's like you got some guys that started and played, and then behind that, it's a new cast of characters, and they've got to grow up and play. I mean, we're fortunate that we have probably 3 deep on the offensive line in spring practice. I think most of my peers don't have 3 deep, but it's not the quality depth that we've had in the past.
I mean, honestly, I think that clip from Kirby is so important in understanding kind of where things stand with the position group that we might believe is sort of the hinge point for how good Georgia's going to be this year. As I said, we like to keep things simple when possible because that just gives me a better chance of understanding it. And it may not need to be any more complicated than this. With all of the reasonable expectations for what Georgia can be this year, the big looming question remains the offensive line, as Jake Fromm sort of alluded to yesterday. If you can fix that, then the sky might truly be the limit for anything else you want to accomplish. Now, while I have some time, let me also shift gears to a completely different topic just for a moment. This is the kind of time during the summer when we get to sort of stretch out and think about things that in the sort of fast-paced moments in the fall, you just don't have nearly as much time to consider. I like thinking about history. I like thinking about Georgia's football history. I like thinking about the things that are playing out in front of us and kind of, like I was a kid, Gorilla Monsoon, doing the WWF announcing history being made here. Kind of like the idea of watching history being made. And I think in some form or fashion, we obviously believe that Kirby Smart's career is college football history being made right in front of our eyes. But what is the nature of that history gonna be? Like where is the Kirby career going to end up? It's one of those things, it's like you turn on like Stephen A. Smith or like the old days of Skip Bayless or I guess the old days of Shannon Sharp, who's also not exactly doing that anymore. These guys that have done these sort of cable TV sports shows during the day, everything is always about legacy, especially with like these NBA guys. Oh, it's so-and-so's legacy game or Dak Prescott's they're always talking about legacies. And admittedly, I sort of like legacy conversations too. I do like that. And so I think it's easy to sort of wonder, well, what is Kirby Smart's legacy going to be at the University of Georgia? And this is where I think that at times we've done Kirby a little bit of a disservice because, and y'all know this, and this has been going on now for 10 years, or at least almost 10 years, which is because Kirby worked for a long time with Nick Saban, because Kirby had a vibe that sort of felt a little bit like Nick Saban, and Kirby, to his credit, has certainly been willing to recognize the influence that Nick Saban has had on him as a coach. Therefore, like the legacy of Nick Saban sort of always hangs over Kirby Smart. And it's like the only relevant question that it seems like some people ever want to ask about Kirby is, will he be the Nick Saban? Will he become Georgia's version of Nick Saban? Is that what he's going to be? And look, I think the problem with that is it's going to take us like another 10 years to know that for sure. And it's also an incredible legacy to try to achieve. Putting that aside, it just takes a great number of years to ever figure that out, if that's indeed going to be the case, because obviously the coaching resume of Saban was also accumulated over the course of a large number of years. So for Kirby to do that, if he were to do that, it would take a very long time to get there. And so therefore, it runs the risk of almost making the conversation about Kirby as a coach, it almost makes it feel a little boring If all you're doing is waiting around to see, can this guy become the next Nick Saban, that's a very long-range conversation that doesn't give us very many benchmarks along the way. And frankly, I think when we consider the legacy of Kirby Smart that's being crafted in front of our eyes, I think there are actually some more interesting things we should consider other than, is this guy going to be the Nick Saban? And I'll tell you what's getting me thinking about this today. Our friends over at CBS Sports have been looking at a lot of stuff of kind of like the last 25 years. We're a quarter century. We are a quarter of a century into this new 21st century here, not quite so new anymore. And they've been kind of looking back over the course of the last 25 years. And a writer named Shehan Jayaraja wrote about the most significant coaching hires of the last 25 years. And Kirby Smart came in at number 4 on this list. And if you want to make the case that Smart should have been higher on that, I guess I could listen to that. I don't have a problem with that as an idea. I'm sorry, is he 5th on the list? Is that right? Yeah, so he is 5th on the list. I apologize. I had him 4th, but he is 5th on the list here from CBS Sports. Let me read to you what is said by CBS and the writer Shehan Jayaraja about Kirby Smart, the 5th most significant hire of the last 25 years, saying, we're now getting in the territory, meaning in the top 5, of coaches with multiple national championships, and Smart is perhaps best positioned to join Nick Saban as the only coach with more than 2. Smart has created the closest thing we have to a new Alabama, rattling off 8 straight AP top 7 finishes with consecutive national championships. The only thing keeping Smart slightly lower on this list in the top 4 is that he took over a Georgia program that was painfully close to reaching the promised land under Mark Richt. All 4 of the other situations were bleaker when those guys took over. He says, the writer, in the next decade, though, Smart can easily elevate himself to number 2. So what CBS writer is saying there is you had Nick Saban at number 1, no huge surprise on that when it comes to significant hires. And above Kirby Smart on this list, you've got the former USC coach Pete Carroll, you've got Clemson coach Dabo Swinney, and you've got Urban Meyer, who was both a coach at Ohio State and at Florida. And it's those other 3 non-Saban names that I find to be kind of interesting here for a moment. Pete Carroll, for instance, at USC was ahead of Kirby Smart at Georgia. And I don't necessarily believe that Carroll is a more significant coach than Smart was. Carroll shared a national title in 2003, won one of his own in 2004, and then lost, obviously, to Vince Young in 2005. That's not a resume that's more substantial necessarily than the one that Kirby Smart has put together already at Georgia, with still plenty more room for more success after that. But I do think a lot of people have very fond memories of the Carroll era at USC. And this is the way that humans operate. Humans are not necessarily rational creatures. Humans make emotional decisions and then justify them rationally after the fact, or justify them logically after the fact. And so you can make the logical judgment of, well, Carroll took over a situation at USC that was worse than the situation that Kirby Smart took over at Georgia. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. That's somewhat in the eye of the beholder. But the one thing that Carroll did do that I do think gives him a fond place in the memories of a lot of college football writers and a lot of college football fans is he coached 2 Heisman Trophy winners. He had Matt Leinart, he had Reggie Bush. And I do think that gives him a special place in college football history, because as he resurrected USC, he also cultivated some really memorable and lovable individual talents. People love that era, especially Reggie Bush. Matt Leinart was obviously a part of that. It kind of makes you wonder, going into Smart's 10th season, we've seen him produce a Heisman finalist. But another interesting piece of history he could have is, can he also start collecting Heisman Trophy winners? That would be a way of kind of climbing up the historic ladder. Typically speaking, that's not what Kirby Smart teams are about. You do have great individual success, such as Brock Bowers and obviously Stetson Bennett and some of the names on the defense. But for the most part, Georgia's been kind of a collective ensemble more than just a vehicle for one individual star. But eventually, if Smart hangs around and has the kind of success we think he can have, you may eventually see him start to produce the sort of Heisman Trophy winners the way that like a Pete Carroll would have done at USC. The other thing here is when you look at a guy like, say, Urban Meyer, who's also on this list above Kirby Smart, kind of a non-Nick Saban benchmark here for a moment. Meyer wins 2 national championships at Florida, then goes to Ohio State and wins a national championship there. That's 3 titles for Meyer. You kind of wonder, what would it take for Kirby to sort of surpass that, win the multiple national championships? Maybe not quite to Nick Saban, but could he put distance between himself and the other coaches in college football when it comes to that? That's one of those opportunities he's going to have. And the other name I'm going to mention here just for a moment is that of Dabo Swinney. When we think about Dabo Swinney, we think of Dabo as being a guy that's won 2 national titles. Smart's already done that too. Now, for what it's worth, I think a lot of folks, maybe myself included, also kind of thought that Dabo might kind of have a lid on his resume after what looked like a little bit of regression for the Clemson program. But they shook off a loss to Georgia last year, found their way back in the college football playoff. They're going to be kind of a preseason top 5 type team here this year. Like Dabo would say, hey, listen, I'm still adding to my legacy. But when you think about that legacy kind of for what it is right now, Dabo, I think, has 9 conference championships, if I have this right. I think it's 6 trips to the college football playoff. That's sort of another interesting way to measure Kirby Smart. Now, listen, an ACC title is easier to win, therefore less prestigious than an SEC championship. But how many more SEC titles can Kirby Smart win? He's got 3 now. Kirby will tell you it's just as hard to win one of those as it is a national championship. Winning the SEC for Kirby a year ago, I would say, is a pretty big deal. How many more of those could he have? And frankly, how many more college football playoff appearances can he have along the way to whatever his ultimate legacy is? Because ultimately, just giving yourself a chance in the big event, giving yourself a chance in the postseason is ultimately what I think all of this is about. That's certainly what's fun for fans to play in the big games. And over the course of time, you hope to be able to win enough of those. So to sort of sum all of this up, I thought the piece of CBS Sports was pretty interesting. Could I justify seeing Smart a little higher on the list of most significant hires over the course of the last quarter century? You might could. I would certainly listen to that argument. But ultimately, what's more, I think, interesting than that is when you think about the guys who are sort of in the same historical category that Smart finds himself in, a comparison of more than just Kirby as the next Nick Saban. Can he surpass Urban Meyer? Can he surpass Dabo Swinney? Can he surpass the memory of the legacy that Pete Carroll leaves behind at USC? Can he do those things over the course of the next few years? We would say he certainly could, and if it does play out that way for UGA fans, it ought to be a lot of fun. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. Glad you're with us, no matter how you get to us. Video, 10 a.m. across all platforms. Had a little bit of an issue this morning on YouTube just for a moment. It was kind of teetering on the brink, but our Cody Chaffins stepped in, swooped in, and corrected all of that. And so now we are humming right along as smooth as we possibly can be. And by the way, speaking of Cody Chaffins, our Mike Griffith, who normally joins us on Wednesday, predisposed, not able to be with us. Cody going to pinch hit in place of Mike Griffith here today, and that's going to be a really fun conversation. We'll do that, of course, in a couple of minutes. All of this made possible by our friends at Breda Pest Management. Bugs and critters and all these things. Feels like this time of year, they're just everywhere, right? Especially like the mosquitoes in your yard. It's amazing to me, summer in Georgia brings these insects that are just gigantic. You're like, did this come from another planet? What is this from? Well, that's what our folks at Breda Pest Management want to keep away from you. You don't want the mosquitoes in your yard. You don't want the bugs in your house. There's nothing less pleasant. And boy, you better believe my daughter screams every time she sees one of these things, kind of creeping in. You don't want that stuff in your house. That's what Breda Pest Management does. They keep it outside your house, and that kind of impacts your quality of life. But there's also a degree to your pest control that's also about your investment, protecting the investment of your home. You know this, termites are, in Georgia, a huge factor. You have termite protection already because if you don't properly treat your home from termites, eventually these wood-destroying, insects are going to get in there and they're going to do incredible damage to your home. But the problem is that a lot of these termite companies are not well vetted. You don't really know who they are. They also get sold in conglomeration, things like that. And they send you that letter in the mail, cost of service going up and up and up and up and up and up. And it seems like sometimes the quality of the service you get every year kind of goes down, even as it's getting more expensive. How does that work? We're not sure, but we've certainly noticed it. Well, with our friends at Breda Pest Management, that's not going to be the case. when you make the switch to Breda Pest Management, they're going to put more money back in your pocket just for making that decision. Now, I love Matt Breda. I love the entire team there. These are good people. They're Georgia fans. They serve Georgia fans. They've been a part of our sports community for a long time. But most importantly, they are dedicated to their work, have been for multiple generations of the Breda family, going back to 1975. They've been in business there, got 125 employees. Like, you see their trucks all over the place. Love the Sunny logo. It's a very friendly looking thing. You'll always be glad when you see that truck driving into your driveway because you know they're there to take care of you. So I want you to find them online. It's BredaPest.com, BREDA, BredaPest.com for more on that today. That's BREDA, BredaPest.com for more on that today. So as I told you, before we're done today, it's Cody Chaffins pinch hitting for Mike Griffith. I'm excited to talk to Cody because I know Cody has as much affection as I do for something we're going to get a chance to experience here today. In fact, as a lead into that, let's get ready to go around the doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. So we're going to kind of try to keep it moving here on the show today. Now, we're not off to a great start with that, but we're going to try to keep it moving here today because live on the DawgNation video channels, really in just a couple hours time, we're going to be back on today to cover the commitment announcement up from North Carolina for the 4-star offensive lineman Ekene Ogboko. Ogboko, as you know, is the brother of Nnamdi Ogboko, the Georgia defensive lineman, and Ekene on the offensive side of the ball, a very important prospect here too. We're going to see this go down today. We're going to be on the air live starting about 12:45 p.m. We think the announcement from Ogboko going to come around 1 p.m. So we're going to be all over this news here today. Obviously, these kind of remaining offensive line battles for Georgia in this 2026 class, as we said yesterday, among the most crucial. And one of the things that comes to mind for me about this is I would sort of compare this recruiting battle a little bit to one like, say, completely different position, different situation, but like, say, Kamari Brooks. We just got a commitment date coming up very soon now for Kamari Brooks, the edge rusher out of North Oconee. And because Brooks is geographically so close to UGA, because, we have, I think, reason to believe, been to Georgia just more than a dozen times, many, many times, a lot of these even probably undocumented visits to Georgia, that somehow for Georgia and Brooks, well, it's probably an easy win for Georgia. This guy's right in your backyard. He seems to like you. So therefore, you can go ahead and chalk this up as an easy win. People who know this stuff a little more closely, I think, would tell you, though, well, be careful here. While Georgia has the geographic advantage, that doesn't always work. Alabama has made a really strong push for Brooks. They've tried to indicate to him that he's a major priority for them, even as Georgia's done the same thing. So the bottom line is, if I had to make my prediction, which may not be worth all that much, I would predict Brooks to land at Georgia. But the geographic advantage alone is not enough to seal the deal given the push that comes from Alabama. Perhaps you'd say the same thing for a slightly different reason for Ekene Ogboko. Ogboko's brother plays on the Georgia team, so therefore, easy. Rubber stamp this one, then move on to the next one. But listen, throughout the course of the last few months, and maybe we haven't always done as good a job documenting this as we could have. Throughout the course of the last few months, the battle for Ogboko has been pretty intense. In fact, I think there's some national observers who maybe at one point in time thought he might land at Notre Dame. As just a for instance for him on that. They seem to have been a real strong pursuer of his. But Georgia, though, has been fighting this battle as if they had no family connection to Ogboko. In fact, I want to go back to April here for a moment. Story you saw at DawgNation.com at the time. This is around G-Day when Ekene, talking to our Jeff Sentell, was describing then just how much of a priority Georgia was trying to show Ekene that he was for UGA, the links that it went to on that. Let me show you this on the screen here for a moment. Jeff writes that there's a familiarity there, meaning obviously the brother owner of the team, but that didn't stop Georgia coach Kirby Smart from not taking that for granted after G-Day. I think this is really important. Ogboko told DawgNation he was the first recruit that Smart met with after G-Day. There were a lot of options, but the 6'6", 305-pound Ogboko got that first slot. Here's the quote from Ekene. This is the story from DawgNation in April. They actually told me that to show that I'm a priority for them. They really need me there. And they told me I would be the first one talking to Kirby. Isn't that interesting? First of all, you kind of see, recruits, they want to feel like they're a priority. Obviously, if I'm a priority to you, that means you're going to work really hard to do right by me, which is what recruits ultimately want. And as Ekene would tell Jeff at DawgNation, that's what Georgia was doing for him back in April, laying that groundwork, not taking it for granted that his brother Nnamdi's already on the team. And to be honest with you, Nnamdi Ogboko is a defensive lineman that I really like. I think the sort of space eater in the middle, kind of a run-stopping machine, I think that Ogboko can have a future doing that for the Georgia defensive line. So as a defensive line prospect, I still really like Ogboko a lot. I really do. But Georgia not taking Nnamdi's presence on this roster as some sort of signal that it was going to be easy for them with Ekene, fighting against Notre Dame and other programs like that, showing them it was a priority on G-Day for a good long while now. That's what Georgia's been doing with Ekene, and perhaps today, later on this afternoon, all of that work going to bear fruit, maybe live on the DawgNation video channels. We will hear Ekene Ogboko choose UGA. And that's Around the Doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. We love them, always the home team. We like to say that. That means when you're looking for auto insurance provider, home insurance provider, in some cases life insurance, like other financial services that kind of connected to that, Georgia Farm Bureau wants to provide you great service on that. They've been doing that for our farmers and our agricultural community here in Georgia for quite some time, and now they want to be able to do that for you too. In fact, you can hit them up online, gfbinsurance.com. That's the website, gfbinsurance.com. You can also give them a call, 877-404-1050, 877-404-1050. We love our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. They're always the home team, and we're glad to have them as a part of Around the Doghouse here today. We're also happy to have all of you with us here too. Before we're done, this is kind of interesting. Pretty big war of words seems to be emerging right now between one Big Ten coach and one SEC quarterback, perhaps symbolic of the relationship that exists between the two leagues here at the moment. We're going to tell you more about this here coming up in a moment. But for now, decision day for Ekene Ogboko and everything else going around with the Georgia Bulldogs. Pinch hitting for our Mike Griffith. It's Cody Chaffins from the control room here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We will say hello to Cody Chaffins, who's doing so much behind the scenes, but also on the scene here as well, in place of Mike Griffith here today. And Cody, I think it's actually a great day to have you on the show because throughout your years, previous life in TV and things like that, you've actually covered a lot of these recruiting decisions. And admittedly, this sort of thing isn't always everyone's cup of tea. Some people don't like the drama, and if that's the choice they make as a fan, I totally get that. For me, though, I love it. And to use a word we've already used in the show today, I love the simplicity of it. I love the young man's going to sit down at a podium, and even when you think you know what he might do, and I'm not going to lie to you, obviously, I do expect Ogboko to pick Georgia today. The truth is, we've also done some of these over the course of the last couple of years when I thought for sure a guy was going to make one decision, he made a completely different decision. To me, it's just really simple, straightforward drama. This is one of those things that we as an industry sort of stumbled into a few years ago of, hey, guys are making announcements. Why not stream these on video? And I just think there's something really, really fun about sitting there and watching a young man say a name, and it's sometimes the one you think it's going to be. Sometimes it's the one you want it to be, and sometimes it just ain't. But it's always good drama one way or another. When you reflect back on your own kind of memories covering these sort of announcements, what comes to mind?
I've done so many of them, and you get into the room, right? And you have an idea of what you think might happen. Then you start looking at, can I see some kind of sleeve underneath that pullover that they're wearing? What color is that? What color is mom wearing? And you wonder, most of them that I've done have been in the state, so it's a big Georgia crowd anyway. Yeah. And is that going to affect things? Is that, are they going to pull him their way? So I think back on the ones I've done, and I've done a lot of Georgia ones, right? Malachi Starks, I was there the day, Trayvon Walker, Tate Ratledge, Smile Munden, did all of those, but I also did some ones that did not go the way that folks are. Barrett Carter, one that got away from Georgia, of course, went to Clemson, now in the NFL. Connor Lew, who the day we were there, committed to Miami, who was at up there at Kennesaw Mountain, is now at Auburn having a very good career. So I've done some that haven't gone to Georgia as well. And I think to this one today, Ekene Ogboko, we've got our Kaylee Mansell, our Jeff Sintel heading up to help us stream this one. And the last one they did was Jackson Cantwell. Yeah. And they headed out to Missouri, and everybody's feeling good. And we get there, and then all of a sudden, they told this story on Before the Hedges. They were out to lunch, and there's Drew Rosenhaus talking to his parents about Miami over there. So all these things, Dawg Nation, well, hey, let's be open. We spent money to send them to Missouri thinking that Jackson Cantwell might become a Dawg, and they get there and realize this thing ain't happening. So there is drama, and I know a lot of folks will poo-poo it because they'll say, oh, they'll just decommit. But as you talked about on this show, in this new world, these commitments actually are gaining more importance back, because a lot of times they're doing these ceremonies and they're putting pen to paper, even though it's not officially signing day. There's some NIL stuff happening behind the scenes that is locking these guys in. So for a while there, it was like, yeah, tell me when he's on the field. But now it's gotten to a point where these decisions are gaining the importance back that they had when a guy like Isaiah Crowell pulls out the Bulldog.
Yeah, and look, obviously throughout the years on DawgNation, there's also been kind of the knock of, well, y'all wouldn't be doing the announcement if you didn't think he was coming to Georgia, so therefore the cat's out of the bag. But the truth is, and this is not just kayfabe, the truth is there are a lot of moments in which we don't really know what's going to happen. In fact, I've kind of
Justice Terry.
Yeah, exactly. I've kind of pretty jaded about this, throughout time. I don't think any one recruit's going to change the fortunes for Georgia necessarily. But when the announcement comes down, I still sort of get those butterflies in my stomach a little bit, because even if you think sometimes you just don't. And
Justice Terry's wearing red. He goes to Manchester, which is not a red team, and he's wearing red and then picks Texas.
Exactly right. Or and some of these that eventually circled back, like C.J. Wiley comes to mind, where, and you mentioned, to me, the vibe in the room is always so important. And, Milton is a place where you're going to have a lot of Georgia fans, obviously suburban Atlanta. And, the Wiley announcement when he first picked Florida State, because I think, if memory serves, if it was not Georgia, I don't even think that Florida State was necessarily the next most likely.
LSU, right where his dad went.
That's exactly right. You're thinking more like an LSU type of thing. And when the Florida State thing kind of comes out of nowhere, it's just sort of that sort of jaw-dropping thing of sort of everybody in the room is sort of trying to act not too surprised by all of that. It's why the simple drama for me is so much fun, and the kids and their families are kind enough to let us be a part of that. And look, I also try to remember that we're a Georgia-focused show, so we're thinking about what's good for Georgia. But when guys make a different decision, whatever decision they make, it's still a big day for them and their family. And I think I always want to come across as showing them a lot of respect for a dream come true of playing college football, even if it's not for Georgia. But obviously the will he, won't he of Georgia is one of those things we kind of always are going to remember.
Yeah, and you do have to remember, these guys are doing something you and I had never had a prayer of doing, right? Committing to play Division I college football. So again, wherever they go is an incredible story for these guys. And the way DawgNation treats them is the way Kirby Smart will treat them moving forward, even though they may be locked in. Down the road, you don't want to close those doors. And a guy like Ekene Ogboko, Georgia really needs to get, because they need a win on the offensive line in this 2026 recruiting class. But you never know what comes back around. Maybe he spends a year away from his brother and realizes, hey, I would rather be closer. So you still want to have that good relationship and stay on good terms. But I think Ogboko today, like we said, the Cantwell miss makes this one that much more important. And he's listed as one of the top inside offensive linemen, interior offensive linemen in the nation. But he's a guy that Georgia has told him they could see play on the outside, and something Jeff Sintel's talked a lot about on Before the Hedges, presented by Kroger, is that Georgia can see him as a tackle. And after the Cantwell miss, we looked at that tackle list, and you're like, oh, dude's committed. It got real thin real fast. Malachi Lee out of Hawaii is like the other guy, and he's committing very soon as well. That makes, if this one misses, that one makes that one even more important. But if you can get a win on the offensive line for the 2026 recruiting class, that would be huge today.
All right, let me say one more thing about this, and I want to ask you about something else before we say goodbye here, which is, as someone who's anchored a lot of these, and you've kind of done your version of this too, the one thing I'm always really careful about is I don't want to get drawn off sides by either missing the announcement or being confused by it, or, obviously throughout the years we've seen like the sort of put on the one hat, throw the other one off. I don't think I've ever been fooled by anything like that, I don't think. But there's always this thing of, hey, some guys sit down at the table and they just sort of get right to it. In other cases, it's like, this is your life, and they sort of bring on, every single person to speak. And then I would say that some announcements are slightly more complicated than others. They involve wardrobe changes and live animals or videos and things like that. I think part of the fun, and although also part of the challenge if you're trying to do this for a living, is following the ceremony and feeling like when you have for sure seen what is essentially the final announcement of all of these.
Yeah, and you want to know what's happening. Do you cue the fight song right off the bat? I think back to Chase Linton, right? Yeah. He went through like 3 things, and he pulled them off really slow. And as we've gotten to hear from Chase after that, and we saw his personality in the one we did there.
Oh, yeah.
But like, he put on the tech thing for a long time, and tech was up there for him. We knew. And so all of a sudden you're like, all right. And so I'm in the control room. I'm typing up the lower third to say Chase, putting it up there. And yeah, you got to hold off a minute because there is some dramatic. I do wonder, like, Jared Curtis just got down and dirty. But then you got a guy like Ryan Montgomery who had to walk out of the room and go get a bulldog and come back into the room. So it's always interesting. I'll tell you one more funny story. So like I said, I did Malachi Starks up at Jefferson, and we were doing it live on the news. And the sports segment, if you watch a lot of newscasts, comes at the very end.
Yeah.
So we had and we've had guys that just go, I'm taking my talents to wherever, and that's it. So we asked a couple questions of Gene Cathcart, who was the coach there at the time. Just tell us about, Malachi, what makes him so special. So, all right, Malachi, it's your turn. We had about 2 minutes left in the show. Malachi, and as we've come to find out, what an incredible person he is. Both his parents are from Jefferson, so he had a lot of people to thank throughout the city, and the folks that coached him in Pee Wee football, and I've got a producer in my ear saying, Cody, we've got 30 seconds in the show, not 30 seconds for him to make the thing. Like, we're going to cut off, and the next show will start on this TV channel if he doesn't get to it. So literally he goes, University of Georgia. The crowd goes wild. I go, and he picks Georgia, back to you. And so there was no why'd you pick Georgia? Tell us about Kirby Smart. Are you going to play both ways? All those things that we wanted to ask never got on the air, and he barely got in under the gun. So yeah, you never really know how a guy's going to do it. I wonder about the offensive linemen because they're not usually the showboat types. But you may see something fun today.
Yeah, it could certainly be that way. Before we let you go, I want to bring you back into a conversation we were just having too, to get my point on this, that we're about, somehow, some way, I believe we've probably entered the sort of second half of Kirby Smart's coaching career. We may be deep into the second half, depending on whatever decision he chooses to make. But for the most part, we were at least kind of post-halftime, I would believe, in this Kirby Smart coaching tenure at Georgia, and I am curious about what his ultimate legacy is going to be. And obviously, I do think at times there's almost too much in the way of the Nick Saban comparison, because that just sort of leaves you with very little, I guess, room for evaluation until you get to the end of the career and you see if you stacked up as many championships as Saban was able to stack up. But when you see Kirby alongside a Pete Carroll from his time at USC, or a Dabo Swinney still at Clemson, or Urban Meyer at a couple of stops at both Ohio State and Florida, I think those other certainly stellar coaches in the sort of non-Nick Saban category, I think those become interesting for Kirby. Can he produce Heisman Trophy winners like the way that Carroll did? Can he win more conference championships, more playoff appearances, similar to what a Dabo has been able to do in what we would say a lesser league in the ACC? Urban Meyer still sort of stands as a big figure in college football, even though his, I think, reputation has been somewhat diminished in recent years because of how it ended for him in Jacksonville. I think some of these other comparisons become pretty interesting for Kirby. Do you get what I'm saying when I bring that up?
Yeah, and I think Kirby has a chance to really prove himself moving forward. The one thing, you talk about all those guys, what they were able to do, Pete Carroll won with Heisman Trophy winners. Okay, that's great. And how did he get those Heisman Trophy winners? Well, Reggie Bush and his Heisman Trophy will tell you about how he got those Heisman winners. Nick Saban played with the best players because he could just out-recruit everybody. So Kirby has a chance now. He's done that, where he's out-recruited everybody and won back-to-back championships in 21 and 22. But now he gets a chance to show, I can do it in this new era of college football. And that will be the really interesting thing, and thing that may set him apart from the other guys when it's all said and done. He did it in the old era. And if he can do it in the new era and get to the mountaintop one more time and say, I'm doing it without the depth, without just having the stockpile of 5 stars that everybody else has, I think that will set him apart. The one thing I think that was interesting in that, they talked about how he had a much better situation walking into. When we think back to 2015, were we feeling like this is a great situation for Kirby Smart? I don't think we were.
Yeah.
The other thing different, too, is that and hopefully he never has, right, is Nick Saban did it at LSU and then came and did it at Alabama. And Urban Meyer did it at 2 different stops. He'll never get a chance, hopefully, to prove that. But I do think playing in 2 separate eras, if he can get another national championship, that'll be something different from all of those other guys and really put him on a pedestal that can be unmatched. And I do think the longevity will play a part. If he only goes a couple more years and Andrew gets to high school and he wants to go watch more high school games, then it could be different. But I do think longevity, if he stays there for a little bit longer too, he's just by his nature going to rack up more championships.
No, I think that's really interesting, Cody. I love talking to you. You do a great job. It's fun to have you on the show today. And, of course, we'll be a part of the live coverage of Ekene Ogboko later on this afternoon. Hopefully, folks will tune in and watch that live here on the DawgNation video channels, 12:45 p.m. We're expecting to kind of kick off the broadcast. Ekene getting ready to make his decision, we believe, somewhere around 1. Okay. Cody, great to speak to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Filling in for Mike. I thought I needed to bring my boxing gloves, but you were nice on me. I appreciate it.
Cody, thank you very much.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Something that Cody said kind of gets me thinking about something different. He said something to the effect of, okay, well, now Kirby's going to try to show you that he can win in this era. And I do believe whatever, quote-unquote, this era is, I believe it's more difficult than college football has been in the past. The playoff is longer now. The SEC is deeper. You know, it's just easier to lose games now than it used to be. And I'll tell you what this reminds me of. And I don't know if you're seeing this. I feel like I'm seeing this on social media now in a way that feels a little bit new to me. I'm seeing more Tiger Woods, Jack Nicklaus comparisons. Now, that obviously just sort of speaks to whatever they think my algorithm is. But I'm seeing more Tiger Jack comparisons. And this is a thing that I'm seeing kind of pushed in a way you didn't really used to see. You know, if you look at the tail of the tape between Jack Nicklaus and Tiger Woods, Nicklaus essentially has more major championships, more runners-up, more, all the numbers sort of favor Nicklaus. But there's an argument now in favor of Tiger Woods in terms of who the greatest golfer of all time is. Yeah, but Tiger was winning his tournaments with deeper fields. And someone like, say, Scotty Scheffler now may be winning his tournaments with, even in the split age we live in now, at least in terms of major championships, deeper fields than used to exist. That Jack may have the numbers, but we're seeing more modern golf fans kind of now trying to push the idea that's an easier era. Not my point to settle that discussion necessarily, but it's an argument I think you're hearing more frequently than you used to. If any degree of that is true in golf, comparing Nicklaus to Tiger and perhaps soon Scotty Scheffler, it's definitely true in college football. That, for instance, if Nick Saban's on the top shelf with X number of national championships and Bear Bryant's, in a similar category with his, impressive resume, a smaller number of championships in this age, I think, should be viewed just as impressively as what previous guys have done. And by the way, that's not an argument in favor of Kirby Smart's the greatest coach. That's going to be true for which any coach you talk about. It's just harder to win now than it used to be. And so therefore, when we do see guys putting success together and winning, at an impressive clip, I do think you have to grade on a curve for the era in which we're currently in. Something to keep in mind. Let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here right now. And obviously, speaking of keeping stuff in mind, I hope you're thinking about all kinds of fun stuff when it comes to Royal Caribbean here, including those ships going to Perfect Day Coco Cay. Now, y'all know this. I say it all the time. Perfect Day Coco Cay literally is about the best thing I think you can do in terms of just sort of a getaway. If you want to like put your mind and just completely just go on shutdown mode and just sort of relax, I don't know that there's any place literally in the world that conjures that feeling for me more so than Perfect Day CocoCay. The reason why it's important is because the only way you can get to this wonderful private island oasis there in the Bahamas is on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. Only way you can get there. And Jessica Slater is standing by to tell you how you can book yours. Whether it's the all-new Star of the Seas coming up, Utopia of the Seas, which has been kind of our home for our DawgNation cruise both last year and this upcoming April, Icon of the Seas, and all the other great ships now and soon to be a part of the Royal Caribbean fleet. You can be on those ships. You can go to Perfect Day CocoCay. You can have a great experience. So give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She will tell you all you need to know. All right, let's have some fun for a moment. Very interesting war of words over the course of the last 24 hours as it relates to the kind of burgeoning feud between the SEC and the Big Ten. Now, some of this exists at the institutional level. These are the two power leagues in college football right now, and there does not seem to be a lot of agreement about what the future of the college football playoff should be, according to these two leagues. It certainly seems like Greg Sankey, speaking on behalf of his SEC stakeholders, wants, if it's a 16-team playoff, they want more at-large spots, recognizing what they describe as the true best teams. The Big Ten, led by League Commissioner Tony Petitti, it seems like they want more automatic bids, guaranteed qualifiers in this. That seems to be the sticking point there for them. So there is true institutional disagreement between the SEC and the Big Ten. That is real. That's more than just some sort of media creation. However, at the level below that, with coaches and players, you've also got a war of words starting to kind of develop here too, which seems like it's sort of a real thing. So Diego Pavia, the Vanderbilt quarterback, goes on is it the Bussin' with the Boys show? Is that what he was on in one of those sort of Barstool style shows? I think it's Bussin' with the Boys. I think that's what he was on. So he goes on that show. And my opinion on this may somewhat surprise you a little bit because like Pavia is a guy that I've really been entertained by. You know, what he did at Vanderbilt a year ago, I think was terrific. I think he's done himself no favors, though. You go on this podcast, it's the sort of thing we've seen other people do where you go on the show, you try to act cool on the podcast because that's what some of that kind of stuff sort of feels like you're supposed to do. And you say all these sort of wild, slightly edgy things. And I mean, we've seen broadcasters get fired because of this. You know, you go on there, you try to act cooler than you actually are. You try to sort of push the envelope and say something shocking. You know, there's a tendency for everybody to want to kind of go viral if they feel like that's what the expectation is. And sometimes in the sort of try hard attempt to do that, you end up really messing yourself up. I can think of examples of that in the sort of Barstool era where guys have gone on shows like that, tried to be funny, failed, and ultimately cost them their employment. That's happened. So Pavia goes on, you know, this show, and he's, you know, all this crazy stuff, like, you know, got offered these millions of dollars and turned it down. And, you know, I guess the most interesting thing that he said is that when it, you know, came to the potential of transferring, Pavia said, you know, if a Big Ten school called him, he goes, listen, you don't even answer those calls. You just ignore those because, as he said, nobody wants to play in the Big Ten, essentially describing that as an inferior league. Now, I am all for SEC pride especially at the expense of the Big Ten. I'm for that. I feel like Pavia could be my ally in all of that. I am just, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So anybody within the SEC that wants to take shots at the Big Ten, for the most part, I'm sort of okay with that and frankly kind of here for it. However, there is a degree to which, and I say this as someone who likes Pavia, there's a degree to which this sort of feels like the thing the other day when Brian Kelly was kind of calling out the Big Ten saying, you guys may be on top right now, but we're coming for you. And my message to Kelly, and you'll remember this if you are a regular listener to the show, I said, you know, I need you to not participate in this sort of trash talk battle until you get some wins. You know, you've had the week one loss to LSU, I should say at LSU, to Florida State a couple of times, embarrassing to USC last year. You need to beat some of these teams before you start talking about what it is you're going to do. I need you to sort of sit this out. In a roundabout way, I sort of need the Vanderbilt quarterback to do the same thing. And listen, we all like Pavia. We're entertained by him. The fact that he's coming back, I guess I'm okay with that. Although not my favorite thing that these, sort of Peter Pan style football players are going to just keep playing college football in perpetuity. But nonetheless, he's an entertaining character, I reckon. But I don't need the Vanderbilt quarterback leading the way when it comes to trash talk with the Big Ten. That's just coming from too small of a place. Don't need to hear this from you on that. But the response was, well, you knew it was going to be coming, and we've gotten that from Illinois coach Brett Bielema, who I guess was at one of these like rubber chicken things or something like that. I'm going to read you the quote from Bielema in response to Pavia. So to give you an idea of how deep into the offseason we are, we've got a war of words between the Illinois coach and the Vanderbilt quarterback. Like that's where we are right now in terms of this stage of the offseason. So Bielema says, I understand what he's saying, meaning Pavia. He's regurgitating what's being said to him, I think, probably. He says, listen, the Big Ten, I grew up in this league, was very successful at Wisconsin. My first bowl game, we beat an SEC team. I actually ended up working for later, right? I think any given Saturday, anybody can get anybody, and that's what played out in this bowl game, right? So I got so much about this. Like, Bielema's always been a guy I've generally had a decent amount of respect for. But I feel like lately he's getting on my nerves, I guess the way you say this, so badly. First of all, Bielema should know this, and he worked in this league. He should be aware of this. SEC coaches don't brag about bowl wins. They don't. Like, for instance, Eli Drinkwitz beat Ohio State in a bowl game just like, essentially 2 seasons ago. But it's not like Drinkwitz is walking around saying, hey, we beat Ohio State. For better or for worse, SEC teams don't brag about bowl wins. They just don't. It's the same thing for like the SEC in bowls as it is as like, say, baseball teams, in the College World Series or the NCAA tournament. SEC teams are expected to win, so therefore there's no reward for the win. There's only punishment if you lose. Bowl games kind of work out the same way. If you're in the SEC, you win a bowl game, you just sort of move on. That's kind of what you're expected to do. Brett Bielema, admittedly, Illinois beating South Carolina, kind of a wild game, pretty big win. I think that South Carolina was trying. It was legitimately a big win. But how many spins around the block is Bielema going to try to get off this bowl win for Illinois against South Carolina? SEC teams don't brag about bowl wins. And Bielema is still bragging about a bowl win he got as the Wisconsin coach. Now, what he does not tell you is that Bielema also had his chance to play as many SEC teams as he wanted as the Arkansas coach. Now, let me ask you a question. How'd that work out? When you got a chance to play SEC teams every Saturday, how is that going for you? Not great. If you want to check the Wikipedia page, you can find that out for yourself. So the point is, SEC, Big Ten, wars of words and conversation, we don't think that's going to be going away anytime soon. There's some real tension between these two leagues. You can't help but notice it. So much so that you've got the Vanderbilt quarterback and the Illinois coach. Not exactly the most distinguished rivalry of all time, but a rivalry perhaps nonetheless. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And as we wrap up here today, happy to let you know, Golden Shoe, speaking of, we talked a lot of recruiting and recruiting wins for Georgia over the years and things like that. We can celebrate today a former recruiting win for Georgia, a legacy to the program, now back with UGA. And this is kind of fun for me because it's sort of the DawgNation era. Remember Jaden Hunter, former Georgia player, obviously a Georgia legacy, and now back with Georgia. Going to be working as a defensive analyst with this program here, kind of back with UGA, and excited about that. Anytime a former Dawg comes back to Georgia, we're always really happy about that. Hunter's got a cool story kind of connected to him because of his father, and of course his own football career too. So happy to see Jaden Hunter now back at Georgia. Valuable addition, we believe, to this Georgia program, and best of luck to him as he helps populate this roster with good players in future years. And keeping that winning streak alive against Florida, a big part of that too. How about 1,684 days? That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you this afternoon for the big announcement from Ekene Ogboko. And, of course, back here tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. So it's going to be a quick spin in the conversation right now for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down, because I do want to create some space for our broadcast later on. We're inside of 2 hours of being back on the air for that. So we're going to cover that here with you right now. Have the conversation, and then we'll be ready to cover that for you later on this afternoon, I mean to say. All right, on Facebook to begin things here today, Peter Wilson, good to see you, and thank you for the kind words. Chris Adams checking in. We're glad to have you here. Ken Holcomb, by the way, talking about with Philip Jordan Wells, the Forrest Gump soundtrack. That's a really, when I was, I would not count Forrest Gump among my favorite movies. I know some people really, really like it. I wouldn't really count that among my favorite movies. But boy, I do like that soundtrack. And there was a time, mid-90s, I listened to that thing all the time. I was kind of introduced to some of that sort of 60s style music that's on there. I was introduced to a lot of that music through that Forrest Gump soundtrack. I really was. Jeff Ingram says, why would a coach go so low as to discuss openly with a player from another team? I think he's referencing Bielema with the Pavia thing. Yeah, listen, Bielema is a little bit of a wild card in that he was like dusting it up with somebody earlier. He's definitely been a little bit of a flag waver for the Big Ten as of late. And I'm sorry, I just don't find the Bielema resume all that distinguished. I just don't. He was in the SEC. Nobody remembers because he won essentially no games. Let's see what else. But he is definitely very into this whole SEC versus Big Ten thing. Now, I think that's giving Bielema some form of a personality, something he perhaps has not previously had. Robert Brown says he's listening while working. Go Dogs. I love that, Robert. Thank you so much. You know, when we created DawgNation Daily years ago, I think the one thing that I don't think I ever could have considered was all the different ways in which people had accessed the show now. Like streaming video is not really a thing when we first started the way that it kind of has become now. It just didn't really exist. But one way or another, what Robert says he's doing is kind of the idea behind the whole thing. Whether you're exercising or you're working or you're driving a long commute, whatever your story is, we just wanted to be there for you on all of that. And it's really the thing for, everybody wants to believe they do important work. It's just a thing that, humans require. You want to feel like you're a part of something significant. And, as a person who sort of talks sports for a living, sometimes I kind of wonder, what is important about the work that I do? Because there are clearly things in life far more important than who wins and loses a football game. Clearly there are. In fact, in our world right now, you see many of those things playing out. And so the one thing that I've kind of learned over the years is, hey, if people are doing important work that choose to listen to me while they're doing, in other words, if I can keep them company, if I can make it just a little bit more enjoyable, if I can make the day just kind of, if I can just make it better somehow, that's important work. If people who do important work use me as a way of making their work a little more enjoyable, that's all I need right there. That is literally all I need. So when we got a lot of people doing some real serious work who are a part of our audience each and every day, and I am thankful for that. I'm talking about hard work. I'm talking about moving dirt and building things and creating things that didn't used to exist. I love it. I love it. Really good stuff. Cody BMW MC says, has anybody been collecting some Brock Bowers cards or Ladd cards? So I obviously love sports cards. I don't know. I think I've got some Brock. Like I don't spend big dollars on cards right now just because that's not really, I've got two kids that are sort of draining every dollar from my account before I can ever do that. So I usually go more of the sort of lower end kind of base product type stuff. I don't know that I have any Ladd. I do have some Brock though. I do have some Brock. Let's see what else. Yeah, Yeah, Barry Watkins asking about when the announcement is. Yes, so we're going to be on the air just before 1 p.m. We'll probably get going around 12:45. Announcement itself comes around 1. I tell you this, speaking of our buddy Philip Jordan Wells, you go pound for pound with him on pop cultural knowledge. There are going to be few people who know more than he does. UGA Marine says, don't worry, when your kids are done draining your account, your wife will drain it on grandkids. Hey, listen, I would say there's probably nothing better to spend it on, too. That's awesome stuff, man. That's awesome stuff. Very, 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 very good stuff. I hope that one day that's true for me, for sure. Spencer Clark says, we expect Georgia to win every game now. Yeah, I mean, the SEC is a great place to be for a coach or something like that, as long as you win every game you play with some degree of style. It's an easy life as long as you can do that. Trevor Maffetone says, how high are you on Elijah Griffin? I certainly believe that Griffin's good enough to play for Georgia this year. I do. I don't think he'll be like the main starter. I think he'll be part of the rotation. But we've seen freshman defensive linemen play here in the past. I believe he's going to have a chance to be a part of that group here this year, certainly contributing to that. Overall, I feel pretty good, I think, with the Georgia defensive line, and I do believe that Griffin's going to be a part of that. And then maybe after that, best player in the SEC along the lines of some of what Georgia's had before. But anything like that's going to come true on kind of a year 2, year 3 basis, and we'll judge what we see from him on the field this year to confirm those sort of high-end projections one way or another. Paul Moon says, if you were to consider Georgia versus Alabama for RBU, which is an argument that has literally been going on in this YouTube comment section since the show began on YouTube. He says, do you consider the NFL career as part of the equation? I do not. So, Paul, I'm going to be very honest with you about something. Very honest about something. And this is just as honest as I can be. For stuff like this, when it comes to like arguments with other fans and things like that, if I'm being completely honest, it depends on if I feel like if it sort of depends on whether or not that particular fact helps or hurts my argument. I would say that my larger opinion is I care about the NFL like 1/100th as much as I care about college football. So anything related to the NFL is fairly insignificant to me. I watch the league. I'm entertained by the league. I'm really not moved emotionally by the league at all. I'm just not. I think it's a well-played brand of football. It's a dominant TV product, and they do TV really well. If you sort of, wake up on Sunday after a busy day of college football, it's just sort of an easy way to sort of tune in and turn out and just let your mind, kind of relax while you watch the games. They do TV very well. It means nothing to me. Means nothing to me. Doesn't make me feel anything. So therefore, I typically would not use an NFL legacy in my argument. But if it helps my argument, I might. And that's just the honest truth. Yeah, Paul Moon says he also agrees. Watch the NFL, but don't really care about it. Yeah, and I don't even fully understand why that is. I have my theories. I don't fully understand why that is, though, but kind of always been that way. And you know what? My son, exact same way. Watches the NFL, but I mean, he's just living and dying with college football. Now you'll say, well, he's got your genes, or you sort of raised him to be that way. And I certainly never sat him down on my knee as a youngster and said, hey, young man in this house, we don't care about the NFL. Never said that. He maybe has obviously observed that behavior from me. And of course, being a believer in genes, he's probably, got some of those same genes in him. But amazing. Even him, kind of the same way. Anything in college football is more interesting than everything from the NFL. By the way, D. Nelly giving a shout out to Derek Henry, Mark Ingram. Yeah, they've had Alabama's had some good backs, no doubt. Good backs. Not as good as Georgia, but some good backs. Chef Jay Bowen says, I picked up a copy of the Athlon Sports magazine yesterday. I really like the feel of the cover. I don't know what kind of paper they use, but it feels great. I did notice that too. And look, we're coming up, we're in the summertime of year. It's one of those things, y'all have heard me say this before. I just like magazines. I don't want magazines to go away. I just really like them. I think that when it comes to like sitting at the pool, I don't want to take an iPad to the pool. I just don't. I want to be able to like hold a magazine. I think when it comes to a magazine, I end up reading things I otherwise might not read. In other words, if I'm scrolling my phone, so much of this is sort of tailored to my previously demonstrated interests. It's just sort of a feedback loop. It just sort of gives me more of what I've demonstrated an affinity for in the past. Magazines sort of introduce me to new things sometimes. And every now and then you'll start reading something and it's kind of boring and you sort of stop reading it, which you have a right to do. But in other cases, these magazines that bring in a lot of different topics, a lot of different stuff, you sort of learn stuff that you otherwise would have never known. It's just really fun. I like magazines. Some of y'all saw this in DawgNation Cruise. Take a big stack of magazines. And some of them you sort of read cover to cover. Some of you sort of skim. Some of them you sort of toss away. There are other magazines I used to carry around for years. Just because you have a big stack and you never quite get to the end of it and just sort of keep toting it around. Just kind of becomes the thing you do. But I did notice the Athlon magazine, that's not an ad, had a nice cover to it. And I also like that sort of thing too. They have that sort of texturized cover. I kind of like that. Seems high end. Probably not, just sort of seems that way. Let me go back to DawgNation.com. Well, but wait, I tell you this though, magazines, man, they are just teetering on the brink. Because you go to like your local newsstand, a lot of magazines you used to see, you don't see anymore. There's also this sort of like depressing thing where it's like a magazine from like say 5 months ago is still on the newsstand of like, it just hasn't been replaced by any new ones. Jeremy Smith likes the magazines too. And like, I like more than just like college football magazines or even like sports magazines. I like to read about a lot of times when I go on vacation or something like that, when I have downtime, I like to read about non-sports things. I try not to talk too much to y'all about non-sports things, but I do like to read about non-sports things. All right, Bill Camacho checking out. Bill, we're glad you're here. Appreciate that. Cody says he's actually got a couple of Bowers and McConkey autograph cards. That's really fun. Really fun. I do love the proliferation of all of the relic cards, the autograph stuff that exists now. Most of the young guys' signatures, frankly, are pretty terrible. I don't know how Bowers and McConkey signatures are. Most of the signatures are pretty terrible. But I still like the autograph cards. What I wish we would get back to, though, is, and this is very, very dorky, and only a small portion of the audience cares about it. Two things that bother me. A, I don't like the sticker autographs. In some cases, you autograph the sticker, you then stick the sticker to the card. I'd rather have an on-card autograph. And the other thing is, the manufacturer that does a lot of the football cards previously has done them all. A lot of their like relic jersey stuff is not actually a jersey that has any connection to the player whatsoever. They don't really highlight that too much, but it's essentially just a piece of cloth they stuck on there that has no real connection to the player. I'd like to see us kind of get back to like the relic cards actually meaning something. UGA Marine, who lives in Texas, asking me about the Dave Campbell football kickoff magazine. So I don't know that we quite have that here, but I do know that magazine. That's one of those magazines that's, famous enough that, here in Georgia, I sort of know what that is. All right, we're going to get ready to go here in just a second. Eric GA77 weighing in with his magazine preference. Chef Jay Bowen says, my stepfather got me hooked on reading those preseason magazines. They've always been a part of the football season for me. Yeah, me too. And look, here's the one thing that I do genuinely believe. is that, no one's going to be right or wrong much more than about 50% of the time. Like, it'd be hard to get 60% of your corrections right. It'd be hard to get 60% of your predictions wrong. Like, it just, no one's going to be even 60-40 when it comes to their overall predictions. But what I do think is important about the magazines, especially their kind of long-standing tradition, the magazines are a really good way of projecting what consensus opinions are. This is the consensus of opinion leading into the late summer when we get the true consensus that comes from the coaches poll and the AP poll. And y'all, I really do believe this, is that if you want to have the best picture in your mind, whether it's from a gambling standpoint or just arguing with your friends, if you want to have the best picture in your mind of what the season is going to be, understanding the consensus is an important part of this. And every single year, relative to the consensus, we have a few things that almost always occur. For instance, there will almost always be a preseason top 10 team that finishes unranked. Almost always. Almost always. There'll almost always be a preseason top 10 team that finishes unranked. Trying to figure out who that is just fun. It's just fun. And some years it's pretty easy. Last year we nailed them both. Michigan and Florida State called it right before the season began. Other years, not quite as easy. But it almost always happens. It just sort of does. In fact, we've called our shot on this before and been wrong. But it's one of those fun conversations. You'll also have this thought of, it doesn't quite happen as regularly, but an unranked team that finishes in the top 10. You oftentimes have that. Who could that be? So figuring out what the consensus is, recognizing the likely diversions from the consensus is just the name of the game in college football prior to the start of the season. And I really do think, even in this age in which the sport has sort of changed, I actually still think the magazines do a pretty good job of painting that picture for you. In other words, to sort of put perhaps too fine of a point on this, the magazine's not going to tell you who's going to win the national championship. It's just not. But it will tell you who most people think might, and sometimes that's pretty useful information. Going against it, going with it, sometimes that's pretty useful information. Paul Moon also makes the Sony Michel Nate Frazier comparison. We would say that and DeAndre Swift, and we've said this before, are reasonable comparisons right now. Gary Holt asking about Ogboko again. So we're going to be 12:45 or so beginning. Announcement expected to come around 1 p.m. In fact, these are the final comments with that in mind. So Bill Sanders and others talking about, small number of Facebook comments. Hey, I started on Facebook. We've actually read many Facebook comments. I'll tell you this, though, and I'm just being honest. Friends are honest with each other. Y'all have not been commenting on Facebook quite as much lately. The other platforms do comment more frequently than y'all do. Now, you'll say, well, we're not commenting as much because you're not reading our comments. Whatever the reason is, I will say, and I know we're kind of, in sort of a sleepy time, so people are just sort of kicked back and relaxing. I'm certainly not pushing you to do anything, but I will say there have been fewer Facebook comments than there used to be. Chef Jay Bowen asked about my magazine preference. I do really like the Athlon magazine. I think they do a good job. I've known some of those guys throughout the years. I don't know that I know them anymore, but I've known guys throughout the years that have worked there. I think they do a good job. The one that I used to really like that doesn't exist anymore, it had two different kinds of branding. It kind of wore the Street and Smith's brand for a while. You'll remember Street and Smith. It had the Sporting News brand for a while. I miss the old preview that some years was called Sporting News, some years was called Street and Smith. That was a great magazine preview, and I do miss that one. It just doesn't exist at all anymore, the best I can tell. By the way, Eric and on YouTube likes the all-white uniform combo. I got to tell you, I am not a fan of that. I know most people probably do. That is not something I'm a fan of. But I do think that, you do see this interesting situation where Georgia uses all these alternate uniforms for recruiting visits and really has no plans to wear them in the game. And in fact, I'm not even quite sure they even have 100 sets of most of those uniforms that they wear for recruits. By the way, good to see our good friend Faraday Pippin in the comments here today. I like that. Derek Vanover says, how far down the list do you have to go before you pull for a Big Ten team over Florida? Yeah, I can't cheer for Florida against anybody, but I get the point that you're making, which is you've heard the phrase before, like politics makes strange bedfellows. I don't know if that's true or not. That's for a different show to decide. But I do think in the sort of, sort of friend-enemy distinction category, recognizing that the SEC teams may be our opposition, but the Big Ten's growing to become our enemy. I do think there might be some need for some sort of joined forces with certain SEC teams, although never the lousy stinking Gators. Never the lousy stinking Gators. By the way, our guy G. Grace said that Facebook caused me to stop reading his comments. That's not the case. Although it is funny. Spencer Clark says he'd love to see Georgia get back to black cleats. So I grew up in the white cleat era. I feel like the 80s was a white cleat era. I feel like the Hurst, Zaire, Hastings years, my memory is that's when they got back to black cleats. Is that a memory that y'all also have for those of you who are old enough? White cleats in the 80s, black cleats in the 90s. But here's the thing, though, and this is getting deep in the weeds, and we've got to go. So if you were kind of a kid in the 90s, which was sort of very much a black cleat era, high school and college, a lot of black cleats. NFL's never really been a black cleat league, which is sort of a hard thing to say. But a lot of black cleats. But do you know what people did? So with the black cleats, y'all remember this. Garrison Hurst used to do this. You take the athletic tape and you just wrap the cleats so much that by the time you got all that tape on there, they're essentially white. So you had the black cleats, but most of the players, at least a lot of players, were wrapping so much tape on there that was turning the cleats white. I knew kids in my high school that were trying to do the same thing. You don't talk about making a coach mad. Because at Georgia, they'd spend $50,000 on athletic tape, even back then, and not think a thing about it. But in a high school, there's only so much athletic tape in the whole program for the whole year. And it's got to be reserved for guys that, get jammed up. And you got these kids that saw the guys on TV taping up their black cleats and making them white. And so now they're trying to do the same thing. They're going through so much tape trying to turn their black cleats white. Oh my gosh, I remember coaches getting so mad about that.
They called it spatting their cleats, right?
Is that what it's called?
Like spats, like the military would wear. So it's spatting it up. And we had plenty of guys on our team that would do that. The one thing that you also don't realize about doing that, it makes the cleat so much heavier.
Oh, yeah.
And so you're doing all this, and then the guy, and it's usually, right, you're, specialist, right? Some guy that's a running back or a wide receiver. It's making them slower just to have the white tape on the cleats. And
that is
so much tape.
Really interesting, Cody. Spatting, good verb there on that. Coaches used to get so mad about that because for a rural Georgia high school, a roll of athletic tape was a pretty big expenditure. It wasn't like high school football is now. It's a pretty big expenditure. Coaches get so mad at that. I also remember this, and we'll get ready to go. So we used to want to wear black shoes, like sneakers for basketball, because back then everybody was wearing black. We wanted to wear black, and coach would not let us. He said black was slower. The black shoes just were slower than the white shoes. So we had to wear white shoes because supposedly they were faster than the black shoes. That is a real thing. And that's what it was like growing up in the 90s. All right. Justin Ham said he'd wrap mine red or white in high school. See, Justin probably went to one of these fancy schools that had all kinds of tape. We didn't even know what red tape even was back then. He went to one of those fancy schools. All right. Spencer Clark says we focused on wrapping the ankles more than anything. And it's one thing to wrap an ankle, but I'm telling you, and Cody just described it, this wasn't wrapping an ankle. This was wrapping the shoes for like a fashion choice. All right, we got to go. But we're going to be back in like an hour or slightly more than that. So y'all Senior Dog 54, by the way, says that Joe Willie Namath was the first to wear white shoes. That's really interesting. I didn't know that, but it does check out, right? Even if you have only some idea of who Joe Willie was, if there was going to be a guy to sort of do that for the first time, seems like he'd be the one to do it. And, of course, then later on you had the famous Billy White Shoes Johnson of the Oilers and Falcons fame. That's really good. Very good. Garrison Tucker. A very funny line as well about growing up in Social Circle. By the way, shout out to what's the place called? Blue Willow Inn in Social Circle. Shout out to that. Hey, y'all have a great day. Check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust RS Andrews on that. It's hot. It's like legitimately hot. So get your AC unit tuned up to factory fresh specs. Our friends at RS Andrews have got you on all of that online, rsandrews.com. The RS stands for rapid service. Y'all have a great day. See you back here later on for Ekene Ogboko, and then back tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then.